All right, everybody, welcome to the Blue Collar Startup Podcast, where hard work meets big ideas. This is your home for real talk, real stories, and real strategies from the front lines of the business of the trades. I'm your host, or one of your hosts, I should say, Mike Nelson from Five Towers Media.
You are the host, Mike.
I'm
I'm just
a
the
host.
co-host.
I'm one of the hosts.
I'm the
Uh,
co-host, Derek Foster over at Daigle Cleaning Systems. How we
yeah,
doing, Mike?
doing good, man. Doing good.
Good.
Like we were talking about before, today was one of those days where I don't know, man. I think I'm sure this happens to everybody, but definitely when you're a business owner. But every single action I've taken this morning or this today, it's 2:30 almost. Every single thing I've attempted to do today has been met with adversity. Like, you know, yeah, just I mean,
Nothing's easy.
it not a single thing, bro. Like from the standpoint of woke up this morning and had to feed the animals, realized I was out of grain.
Oh
Somehow,
no.
somehow I had finished off the grain last night, not realizing it. So I came out to an empty container this morning, and then like go to get the grain, run it. Store's not open till 8 o'clock, so I got to sit in the parking lot for 30 minutes. Then I come home. I I came into the house before going out to the barn real quick, and then when I got out there, the grain was in my truck. Realized that the truck was locked, so I had to come back to that. It was just like everything. Like there was some little extra step was added. And folks, I'm here to tell you, every single one of those issues were ones that I created for myself. So it's we talk about accountability, man. I can only look at myself in the mirror to see who's to blame for it all. But it was just like, wow, man, my head is so far up my ass today, and getting into my own way is amazing, absolutely amazing.
Well, you gotta feed those. You must have had a bunch of angry animals that were staring you down when you got back.
Well, fortunately, it wasn't that bad because I was still feeding around the time I normally feed.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like if I get out there, there's been 2 or 3 mornings over the last year where for whatever reason I'm not able to get out to feed the animals till like 9:30. Then they're upset with me. But this was still like it was like 8:30, so they were not too upset with me, Derek, but they were hungry. They were
Well,
squealing.
you gotta feed them. Is don't you have some available for sale pretty
I
soon?
do, yeah. Yeah, we've got 7 feeders. I got 3 of them sold. I got 4 of them. I still got to sell. It was funny too because I was reaching out to my customers from my last batch, and they're like, I still got pork in the freezer. I'm like, all right. Well, I got to find some new customers then. But
Where
we'll get
can
them sold.
so just we've talked about this before how it's challenging for small farms to get out to people, but how do people reach you if they want to
Oh,
buy some meat?
yeah, you can shoot me an email, my farm email, which is chousefarm@gmail.com. Um, You got to be local though, guys. We're not shipping this stuff. It's way too much pain in the ass for me to ship a whole or a half pig. But if you want some fresh pastured pork, reach out.
There you
But
go.
I'm sure we'll get them sold. We typically don't run into any issues there. There's always new people in the market, and right now we got that whole Maha initiative with real food, and this is about as real as it gets. So
Awesome
good.
stuff.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So, all right, where are we going next here? New episode formats, guys. If you have not listened recently, you're going to hear some different formats that we're doing. Obviously, we have the Let's Ask Bill episodes, which is also affectionately called The Lab, with Bill Tanzi from the OpEx shop. Bill just comes with so much knowledge and experience and expertise from his career path that he's done over the last 25, 30 years. So, very fortunate to have these episodes with him. We actually work with him as a company. He's been doing so much good for us and really helping us out a lot. So excited to have Bill on those shows. Catamount Roundtable. Derek did an episode with the team over at Catamount Consulting recently about personal professional development. We're going to be getting into some mindset stuff with those guys, as well as some other topics. Just appreciate those guys to no end. I can't say enough about how much they do for the show on and off the air. Also, Stacy from Catamount is coming on with some women in the trades. She's coming on as guest host, bringing some guests, people that she knows, contacts she has from women that are in the trades. Going to kind of talk a little bit about what life in the trades is like from their point of view, their perspective, what they see on a day-to-day basis. So really excited to get those out. And then, of course, we've got the interviews from the field, and that's where we're sitting down with blue-collar business owners talking about how they grew their business, what they do, trials, tribulations, and then of course, moving on over to the Patreon side of things with real world usable information that can help you grow your business. So if you have not checked out our Patreon yet, there's a link in the show notes pretty much of every episode now. We do a little bit of extra episode or extra content each episode that we put in there. And like I said, real usable stuff. I mean, the questions and conversations we're having over there are specifically around if you are a business owner in the trades trying to grow your business, the things that we're talking about on the Patreon side are for specifically for you. It's, in some of the main episode stuff, we talk a lot more concept, we talk a lot more philosophy. And then in the Patreon, we wanted to make sure that we had a place where the rubber meets the road and you guys can get real usable information. So please check out the Patreon, subscribe. It's a huge $5 a month. So while it may send, you might have to skip a meal once in a while to pay for it, well worth it in the end.
Yeah, and just a quick shout out to all of our sponsors who help make the show possible. We got People
Yeah.
Ease, MLB Construction, Martin Electric, Bonaccio Construction, the Michaels Group, Catamount Consulting, the Northeast Construction Trades Workforce Coalition, my team over at Daigle Cleaning Systems, and of course Mike's team over at Five Towers Media.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate all the support you give us.
What
We're
are we talking about?
we are talking about scaling your business at the speed of cash flow. We're talking about to trade line or not trade line. We're talking about do you go in debt? Do you get a small business loan? Do you throw it on credit cards or you just do what you can do with the cash you have available to you? We're talking about scaling, we're
Sure.
talking about cash or debt, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons for both sides, I think.
Yeah, I did. I think a good starting point, Mike, is just, to every situation is different. And I think the different industries and businesses are different and require different amounts of cash to start up. I mean, I can speak from my personal experience and starting up in an industry that was a lower barrier to entry. I was able to put a couple $1,000s on a credit card and have that paid back in 6 months with no interest.
Yeah.
But what I didn't realize at that time is by doing that, I was also able to pay off that credit card and start building business credit. And I think that's a very important thing for people to understand that in order to go to a bank and take out a line of credit or a term loan or any sort of loan, you have to have some sort of credit behind your name, especially for, a lot of the young folks that are out there and want to go into business and are maybe considering that route. Um, but you got to be careful. You don't want to overextend yourself. You don't want to put yourself in a position to where you're locked in or um, you have a huge cloud of debt hanging over your head to where it restricts you from being able to make the right decisions. Um, it's always good, in my opinion, and from what I've learned over the years, to, balance that debt with what the numbers tell you
Hmm.
and make sure before you do take on the debt, you have the revenue coming in the door. I think some folks get themselves in hot water, so to speak, when they get the idea of, oh, I'm going to go buy a fancy new piece of equipment because it looks cool, it fits in with what they do, but what's the plan to pay for that? And how much revenue does that actually return and generate off of that monthly payment? You got to consider, you might buy a $300,000 dump truck or piece of equipment and, take out a loan to do that. But that makes total sense if, your business plan or your business, you have the opportunity to do, you know, $50,000 a month in revenue with that piece of equipment, right? Or $100,000 per month with that piece of equipment. The return should be there. So again, you have to factor in all of the different things at play, but not putting the cart before the horse and making sure that you have the revenue that is set and coming in before you go and sign your name on that line.
Well, and that's the risky part, right? Like, and we were talking a little bit about before the show about this kind of stuff. I mean, personally, I had an experience early in my career, one of my first businesses, where we're like, oh, we got a trade line, man. We'll throw the trade line money at this problem. It'll allow us to do this, and then we'll do this, and cash flow wise, and what ended up happening was business did not take off the way that we had planned. I think as entrepreneurs, we can sometimes be a little too optimistic about what's going to happen and how it's going to take shape. And so, next thing you know, we've got a business that's struggling and struggling even harder because there's this debt hanging over our heads. And so, I say that because obviously there's definitely still a place, and people do this all the time, right? Whether it's a credit card, an SBA loan, a trade line, and they're incurring debt to help them grow. I know plenty of companies that have done this and navigated those waters successfully. I guess, as I'm listening to you talk, D, my question is, and why I set it up that way is just like, how do you balance with how much without going too far, without spending too much money before you make it, right? Like, how do you look at that skid steer to say, all right, I'm going to spend 50 grand on this skid. Do I need to know that I've got contracts in place? I mean, it can't just be guesswork, right? Like you can't just go buy a skid with the idea that, oh, well, somehow I'm going to sell enough work to use this thing and make it worth it, right? Because I've seen plenty of guys do that, and the skid steer just sits there for a year and a half, just soaking up their profits. Um, how
Yep.
do you look at that? Like, what do you say to that? Hey, everybody, just taking a quick break to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Curtis Lumber. Curtis Lumber is the professional's choice for home improvement. From windows and doors, roofing and siding, decks and building packages, to floors and more, trust the pros at Curtis Lumber for expert advice and daily delivery. For locations, visit curtislumber.com. That's curtislumber.com. I've seen plenty of guys do that, and the skid steer just sits there for a year and a half, just soaking up their profits. Um, how
Yep.
do you look at that? Like, what do you say to that?
Depends on the industry again, but if there's a piece of equipment that you can rent for, one or two jobs to get you through those one or two jobs, yeah, it might cost you a little bit more than if you owned it outright, and you don't have that deductible asset on a yearly basis. But you also, if you need a bigger piece of equipment on the next job, you also have that flexibility to go and rent that bigger piece of equipment if you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you now have a loan tied to your name for, a piece of equipment that is there, then you're stuck with it. You have to operate and be able to make money with that piece of equipment.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, funding assets with debt makes sense if you have the sales. So perfect example for, the listeners when we were first starting and I went and realized that we could shampoo carpets and I had no idea, how to do that. Figured it out, right?
Yeah.
I learned and researched and did what I had to do. And then I went out and I sold a couple carpet jobs. And you know, having the not having that asset or a loan tied to having to buy that piece of equipment, it allowed me the flexibility to look for good opportunities that would then allow me to say, okay, this makes sense to do,
Mm-hmm.
and then go purchase the piece of equipment. Now,
Yeah.
that's a small scale example, but before I spent the money to go buy it, I didn't use that to buy a carpet extractor, right? But I made sure I had the work so that way the equipment was paid off in a job or two, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, listen, I've got you mentioned that was a small example. I've got a big example of the exact same thing, and I didn't even think about it until you said that. So I know a snow and ice company, and these
Sure.
guys are a big player in the market, at least in this market, and in other, I mean, they're regional anyway. They're pretty big operation. And these guys, I think for the first 10, 15 years that they were in business, owned no equipment. They rented every loader, every backhoe, every skid steer. They owned none of it.
Yep.
But it gave them a huge advantage because every single year, if people are in that industry, they'll know that every single year you don't necessarily have a contract, a multi-year contract. Or if you do, maybe it's for 2 years, maybe it's for 3 years if you're lucky, but certainly not the life of a loan that you're going to be financing a loader or an excavator or anything like that, right? So these guys didn't have very long-term contracts. And so every single year, by leasing their equipment rather than owning it, they got to either shrink or expand to exact capacity. So if
Hmm.
a contract didn't renew, they weren't stuck with equipment that they didn't need. They just wouldn't rent those pieces that year. And it was such an amazing, like, yeah, they paid more to lease it, but again, they were never in danger financially because of their equipment and because of overhead. Every single year, if
Yeah.
they expanded, they rented more equipment. If they shrunk down, lost some accounts, they'd lease less equipment. On top of that, they didn't have to worry about wear and tear, things breaking. They didn't have to worry about, there was almost always newer loaders and newer equipment as opposed to you buy one. Now you had it for 10 years and it's all beat to shit. Like, I'm so glad you said that about renting the shampooers because there is an example at any scale of business. And I mean, these guys were renting hundreds of pieces of equipment at one point in time. We're talking
Yep.
100 loaders and backhoes and all these other things. Like, not a small scale operation at all. And doing, millions of dollars in revenue all on not owning any equipment. So amazing example
Yeah.
that you brought
Yeah,
up.
and we did, the same thing with VCT flooring. We got into stripping and waxing flooring, and we would go. I would sell the job, secure the work, and then if it was a big enough project, say, okay, that makes sense to now buy that piece of equipment. And while we're doing that work, so let's say, a big construction company, is debating whether to buy an excavator or a plumbing company, a backhoe, so they can charge for it and, bill out their machine rate. They may want to wait for a big project that might be a year in duration where they're going to need that piece of equipment for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
They can buy that piece of equipment, use it on that project. So now they're paying a little bit less and they own it, they can take the deduction. And then while that project's going on, they can then secure another job to follow that up. So that way they don't
Mm-hmm.
have that downtime with the piece of equipment. I think there's definitely a use for debt for sure. Especially when especially working with larger businesses, corporations, government entities, you don't get paid on those projects for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So that's the other component with this, where, a line of credit or a bank loan shouldn't be to go out and, buy a bunch of fancy equipment and hope that sales catch up. I think to your original example, I think that's where people can get in trouble because you can't you can't bank that those sales are gonna go up.
Yeah.
COVID could happen again, right? Like you don't know. There's too many external factors. So, you know, for me, I think it's if you have something that's solid, concrete, you're doing the work and waiting for payment. So the work's been done, the payments have been approved, they're just being processed. That's where you may want to tap a line of credit and float some of that payroll and other expenses, but you know that you're going to get paid on it on the back end.
Yep. I just thought of a question that I want to write down because I want to cover it on the Patreon side, um, talking about the capacity versus output equation. Um, sorry, let me just write this down.
Yeah,
So,
leases are another example. Mike, perfect. I operated out of a garage and then a storage unit, right? And that was what, $100 a month or
yep.
$20 a month. And then eventually, as you continue to grow, you keep your overhead manageable for what volume of work that you have. And now we're in a larger office setup, but it's you have to get to that point and make sure that you have the consistent sales to be able to sustain that.
Yeah.
Some people will sign a lease before or signing a lease before you even start a business. Like you have to pay that rent every single month, regardless of whether you make any money or not.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing. Like if you can get away with the resources that you have, and yeah, maybe it's not ideal, but if you can operate out of your garage or, rent a storage unit or some parking spaces for your equipment rather than going and signing a big lease for a big building, it would make sense to do that.
Yeah. I think that there's a string to pull there in that a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs, especially early on when we have that business idea and we're launching and we're already counting the trillions of dollars that we're going to make because this idea is so amazing and we got such a clever name
Yeah,
and
and I
all
got to
that.
have this fancy office and,
Yes, absolutely, right? They go out and they spend money before spend money before they make it. And I think that this is such an important thing for people to understand in business, especially if you're just starting your business, is that I don't know if there's any I don't know if there's any exception to this rule. I think everyone has to realize that you have to be humble and you have to be as cheap as possible for as long as possible. And be as thrifty as you can. Be creative to not spend money and find ways to do like the leasing instead of buying the loader. Like that you have to be creative in order to fund what you're doing because it's just so easy to get on the wrong side of that equation. And speaking from personal experience, more than once where too optimistic, that sale's going to come through, or like I even did it recently to some extent where I had a client that was rah, 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 we're going to increase the work we're doing with you next quarter by tenfold. And so I'm like, sweet, man, hire an employee to make sure I have capacity for that client. And then we get into the month when we're supposed to start all this work, and I've got my teammate ready and they're all trained up, and radio silence from the client, right? So I'm like, well, I got this employee I promised this work to. Now my client's not answering my calls. Now that's a small example and easy for me to move this employee into other work. But like at the same time, if that was a loan as opposed to an employee, and now that client is radio silent. I mean, there's no contract. There's just the quote unquote promise of more work. That happens to every business,
yeah.
right? So it's like trying to, go back to pulling that string, trying to make sure that you're as thrifty as possible, as much as possible at really at any size business. I mean, but
Yeah, and
people,
yeah, looking for opportunities to be creative and not overextend yourself. So, for example, when we moved down here to Albany, Mike, that was a huge decision for us. I think we were about 40 employees or so. We're operating out of a small office suite and space in the basement,
yeah.
uh, with some parking spots up in Clifton Park, and um, the other tenants in the building absolutely hated us because people would make noise going in and out, and it just got to a point where okay, enough was enough, and we were fortunate enough to find a space where the landlord was able to let us take a small portion of it,
Hmm.
and then okay, we're going to do a 1 year lease and then expand, right? If we needed that extra space, it was still there in that building, but I didn't sign the lease for the entire space up front.
Right.
So you work your way into it as you grow and not overextend yourself. But back to the original point, credit is not a bad thing, and all the young folks listening, you need to build it. And the only way to do that, an easy way to do that, is to put some of your monthly expenses on a credit card and pay it off every month. And gradually you'll build credit. So then when you do need to go get a loan for a vehicle or a line of credit for your business, because those are all personally guaranteed. So
Hmm.
if something falls through, you're still on the hook for whatever is owed.
Or whatever is
So,
owed.
that personal guarantee, they're gonna pull all of your personal credit and they're gonna pull that history. So you have to make sure that you're making on-time payments and that you're helping to build that credit in the meantime.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting conversation too, because there's the only do what you can afford to do with cash mentality, which is kind of like where I'm at this point, just because I have made mistakes with over leveraging myself in the past and then spending years taking care of that debt. And then the other side of it is there's plenty of people that use debt wisely and are able to use it to grow their businesses. And, they're going to tell you all day long, yeah, you got to do it. And then there's that thing in between, you know, it's just such an interesting conversation about who should do what and when and why you should use this option versus that option. Um,
It's
before we start making that jump over to the Patreon side, like, is there any if someone's looking at that, do I stay with what cash I have available and grow at the speed of the cash I have available? Do I do the other side of the spectrum, which is I'm going to get loans or grants or not grants, loans or trade lines, or in the middle, maybe I'm using a little bit of the cash I have and using a couple of credit cards. Like, is there any kind of litmus test for that D, or any kind of words that you of wisdom you would give someone to help them decide which one of those paths they should take?
Debt is not all bad. I don't want to give that
Yeah.
impression, right? But it depends on what you're buying. So really, the magnitude of what you're buying and then how much money what you're buying can make you over that debt. So real estate's a perfect example. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if you use the bank's money to buy, a large property that is going to generate huge cash flow for you on a monthly basis, that's going to clear the debt, it makes sense to do. But if you're spending and taking out that loan on an asset that, just like if the real estate's not rented for a month or two,
Mm-hmm.
you're still on the hook for that payment, right? So same thing with an excavator or a loader. How much money could that make you on a monthly basis? But what are you going to do in the winter when you can't run it?
Right.
So I think the excitement and looking forward, you have to factor those things in, and you have to factor in enough downtime to make sure that it makes sense to actually sign your name on that line, take out the loan, in that it's going to pay for itself and you're going to have enough in reserves to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would suggest using debt only for purchasing assets and being able to use those assets to continue to grow and make more money.
And would you say that because if things go south and they don't go in the direction you're hoping, you can at least sell those assets and recoup part of or all of the
Absolutely.
debt that you have?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and everybody has a different philosophy depending upon what it is. I know there's a lot of companies that have great lease programs on trucks and fleets, and
Mm-hmm.
but again, what happens if you no longer need that vehicle?
Yeah.
So, now you still have to make the lease payments. It's part of your package, and you can't do anything or get out from under that debt.
So I guess to sum it up before we jump over to Patreon, if what I hear you saying is no matter which of those paths you decide to take, you need to make sure you're not being emotional about it, right? So you're not making an emotional
Don't
decision.
get excited by the shiny object.
Don't get excited.
Okay.
And make sure that you have a plan for if things don't work out.
Correct.
Like, right, like you've got to go into it with the confidence that it's going to work out, but you really also need to have a plan for what you're going to do with that debt, how you're going to take care of that debt if it doesn't work out.
Absolutely.
Is that fair? All right.
And then, the other side of it, Mike, do you buy new or used?
Yeah.
So there's a whole there I'm sure we could do a whole show just on that, right?
Yeah.
So just like the rental piece of it, can you go out and buy a piece of equipment that has 500 hours on it and already took that initial depreciation hit?
Yeah.
Some assets hold their value better than others. So again, towards the exit strategy, if you sell this 2 years down the road, are you going to be able to get your money out of it?
Yeah. Or you're still going to be upside down and still be in debt.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. All right, everybody, we are going to jump over to the Patreon side. So many thoughts swimming around my brain. I got a couple of questions that I'm gonna throw at D here when we jump over. Specifically, one of them is going to be about that capacity and output ratio. If you've never heard us talk about that, it's the, you know, how much capacity do you have to how much output do you need, where that ratio is, and how it tells you whether or not to spend money, get debt, hire people, all that fun stuff. That's one of them that's been kicking around in my mind as we've been going through this conversation. Again, check us out on Patreon, everybody. Really appreciate everybody's support, everybody listening. You can find us on bluecollarstartup.io. Of course, the podcast is on Apple, Spotify, Rumble, and YouTube. I think we gotta really look at our YouTube here, guys. So if you're listening on audio, do us a favor, go over to YouTube, hit the subscribe button on Blue Collar Startup. We've got some things that we're trying to work on over there. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the Patreon side.
And that wraps up another episode of Blue Collar Startup, A big thank you to our sponsors, 5 Towers Media, Daigle Cleaning Systems, Daigle Fire Solutions, The Michaels Group, Martin Electric, MLB Construction, Bonaccio Construction, Peoplease, and Catamount Consulting for making this podcast possible. And thank you for tuning in. If you learned something or felt inspired, connect with us on our website at bluecollarstartup.io or email us at hardhat.bcsu@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your questions and topic ideas. Help us spread the word by sharing the show and following us on social media for updates. Until next time, keep on building, keep on dreaming, and keep hustling like your future depends on it.